Welcome to the Unusual History of Everything, the podcast that uncovers the unusual history of everything around us. I'm Karen Lacey.
And I'm Melanie Dellis. On this episode, to add to the Halloween spirit, we thought we'd try to understand how one book could be responsible for centuries of witch hunts.
From the 9th century to the 13th century, witchcraft was looked down upon by the Christian churches as pagan superstition. But in the late 1400s, the heresy of witchcraft as a superstition turned into the heresy of consorting with the devil. In 1481, Pope Innocent VIII was listening to two German monks, Johann Sprenger and Heinrich Kramer, about cases of witchcraft they had dealt with absolutely no help from church authorities. The irritated monks continued to bother the Pope about this for the next 3 years.
In 1484, the Pope had had enough and issued a papal bull giving full authority to the German monks as inquisitors who would search out witches, and it threatened anyone standing in their way with excommunication. This was the first time the entirety of the Catholic faith put itself behind the witch hunts and promoted the capture and confession of all witches. This was great news for Kramer and Sprenger, who, 3 years later, created the most popular witch hunting book ever written, the Malleus Maleficarum.
The Malleus Maleficarum, Latin for the Hammer of Witches, was written around Exodus 22:18. Quote, "You shall not permit a sorceress to live," end quote. However, the idea of a witch and the practice of witchcraft were much older than the Malleus Maleficarum and the Bible, and they developed slowly and in bits and pieces. In the beginning, many men and women were natural healers, calling on spirits or gods and goddesses to bring about change. There was no, quote, devil yet, and there was no, quote, God as we know God today.
Early people needed ways to explain things around them, from land formations they saw to sicknesses and bad luck. They didn't yet understand birth, death, sunrises, or sunsets. They used the plants and animals around them to ask the sun, the moon, and nature spirits to help them and keep them safe. They listened to their leaders who warned them against certain things. They feared the dead and dark places, and so came up with symbols and other ways to protect themselves and their homes. And that is how folklore was born.
When Christianity came on the scene, the churches began incorporating some of the pagan ways of life so that the people would be more easily to convert. On the outside, it worked, although most people continued their pagan rituals in secret. It was that secrecy and the fear the churches instilled in the people that helped develop the heresy of witchcraft. Soon, neighbors were blaming other neighbors for everything from bad luck to the deaths of their animals, and it wasn't long before people turned on each other.
One of the earliest mentions in literature of a witch, by the way, is in the Bible in Book 1 of Samuel, written circa 931 BC. It tells the story of King Saul seeking out the witch of Endor to summon the ghost of Samuel so that he can get help defeating the Philistines. The witch did what she asked, but also predicted Saul's death and the deaths of all his sons. After that, other biblical passages warn people to not use witches to contact the dead. Guess that makes sense.
During the 11th century, church leaders began taking a closer look at pagan folklore that had been taken lightly by the church in previous years or incorporated into Christianity. Inquisitors began examining everything, with a special focus on the weaker sex, women. Soon monks began blaming their wet dreams on women who sat on their chests while they slept and forced them to have sex. Because women weren't allowed in monasteries, it was suggested that women might be demons that turned into female figures in order to tempt the monks into sexual sin and get pregnant.
So like a succubus, basically.
Uh-huh.
It was during this time that the first demonologists appeared, constructing what a witch looked like, what her goals were, and who she was working for. They went back to the Roman idea of a witch, old, gnarled, ugly, and outcast, and they used that to instill more fear. A witch was said to be able to do bad things to others just by looking at them, so people began running in fear of old, poor women in their villages. They began spreading rumors about them, and soon it was said their master was the devil.
The Malleus Maleficarum was written to help inquisitors rid the world of witches, and so it listed a myriad of beliefs about what witches were like, ways people could identify them, and how inquisitors could convict and execute them. The book is divided into 3 parts. The first talks about how witchcraft is real, bad, and anyone can testify against the accused. The second is a collection of what witches do, i.e. sex with the devil, flying in the night, rituals, etc. And the third explains that torture is a fine way to get a confession, and it details out how to hold a witch trial and eventually execute said witch.
In the Malleus, a woman accused of being a witch was often tortured with a witch test that involved dunking her in a body of water. It was really simple. If the woman was innocent, she sank and almost definitely drowned. If she was guilty, then she would float and probably after would be burned at the stake or hung for being a witch. This test was originally written in the Code of Hammurabi, circa 1792 BC, a collection of 282 legal codes that set the standards for fines and punishments. It was created by the Babylonian king of the same name, who had the codes carved into a massive pillar made of diorite, an incredibly hard rock that is difficult to carve, but easily polished. Because of this difficulty, ancient civilizations used it to inscribe only the most important and highly prized works.
The specific code we're interested in here, number 2, refers to men, but it gave the authors of the Malleus a good starting point. Quote, if anyone bring an accusation against a man, and the accused go to the river and leap into the river, if he sinks in the river, his accuser shall take possession of his house. But if the river prove that the accused is not guilty, and he escapes unhurt, then he who had brought the accusation shall be put to death, while he who leaped into the river shall take possession of the house that had belonged to his accuser, end quote.
The Malleus took this and created its own special version, taking out the house as a prize part and changing anyone to woman. Oh, and conveniently removing the whole whoever accused you will be put to death part. Basically, if you were a woman who made it through the Middle Ages without being burned at the stake, hung, or tortured, then you were lucky. Between 1500 and 1660, at least 80,000 people were executed as witches, 80% of them women. You know, I think that at the beginning of this, like right before the book was written, when the churches were forcing people to convert to Christianity and people were doing their rituals and their pagan rituals in secret, and then all of a sudden they started accusing their neighbors of consorting with the devil. So right at that moment, I think that was like a really pivotal moment for the witch hunts all over the world, specifically Europe, because that's where it started. That moment when these people who had worshipped and prayed to gods, goddesses, nature spirits, many different things. They had idols, they had altars. They weren't allowed to do that anymore. So they couldn't ask for help from their deities. They couldn't blame sicknesses and deaths of their animals on a certain spirit or whatever that was in charge of that kind of stuff. And, you know, they couldn't appease that spirit to make that go away. They couldn't do those things anymore. All of their idols were taken away. Everything was destroyed by the churches. And so those people had to find another way to blame all of these bad things on, or another thing to blame these bad things on. And I think that's where conveniently the devil came into play, is they blamed it on the devil, and in that way created a scapegoat, right? For all the people, their neighbors, they were like blaming all their bad luck, the deaths of the crops and the cattle on the devil. But you can't see the devil, but you can see your neighbor who might be an old, gnarled, elderly, poor lady. Or you know what I mean?
Or like an extremely beautiful temptress type
you were
of
jealous
situation that you were jealous of. Yeah,
your husband was looking at.
I mean, a lot of the people who were accused was a form of social control. If you really think about it, because it was a way of, you know, hey, we've got this cantankerous old lady who doesn't get along with anybody, or we've got this person who's a drain on our resources, or we've got this person who I fear is going to take my husband from me.
Right.
All of those kinds of things are at play. And so it's really like a way of exerting social control.
Absolutely. Back then, it was like, God, any bad thing you could say could automatically make you consorting with the devil. It was just, I'm just glad we don't live in that time period anymore. For real. Like, but what's really scary is that the Malleus Maleficarum was around and used until I think the late 1700s.
Yeah, I think so. And I know, here's something that may or may not blow your mind. There's actually an example. It's not like an original. It's much, much later. There's a Malleus Maleficarum at San Diego State University Library. So you can actually like check it out. It's like in their special, well, you can't check it out. It's in their special collection. So you could like request to see it.
Yeah. It went through, I think 6 different reprints with minor changes in it over the centuries. So, I mean, it was popular, and it was a thing that at one point, I think it was the most read book, second only to the Bible.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Well, that brings us to the end of our episode. You can follow the Unusual History of Everything podcast on Instagram at The Unusual History of Everything and on our Facebook at The Unusual History of Everything podcast. You can see our show notes on www.musecuratorial.com. The Unusual History of Everything is written, produced, and directed by Melanie Dellis and Karen Lacey.
New episodes air every Tuesday on all podcast outlets. Be sure to subscribe to us so you never miss an episode and leave us a review. You can also see photos from our episodes and more on our website, Instagram, and Facebook. Thanks for listening. I'm Melanie Dellis.
And I'm Karen Lacey, your host for The Unusual History of Everything.
Da, 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 da.